Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight this artist talk. To begin, for those who don't know them, Petria Mitchell and Jim Giddings have been professional artists for over 40 years. Throughout have been actively involved with several nonprofit arts organizations, and from them was born Mitchell Giddings Fine Arts, the wonderful gallery we have the fortune tonight of coming together in and discussing the topic of art and its necessity. Despite their role in curating this show, we're here tonight to listen and to discuss with them their role and their experience as artists in honor of the work you see before you. I will admit, 8 weeks ago when Petey and Jim told me they were going to do a combined exhibit, I thought they had lost their mind. They had no new work to speak of at the time, and the thought was simply irrational that they would be able to produce a full inventory for a show in a little over a month, not to mention deal with all the curatorial duties that surround a show. To my absolute shock and amazement, however, in 6 weeks they produced this array of immense beauty that hangs before you. And they did so without putting themselves in the hospital from the process. Further, what really surprised me was in the few times I saw them in those 6 weeks, a sense of peace and contentment came off of them that I had not noticed before. I say this not to convince you that the preparation for this show was stress-free, not at all that case, but to speak to the incredible, and I would argue essential, vitality that artists derive from the sole act of creating. I contribute the contentment I felt from Petey and Jim to the fact that this show and its impossible deadline forced them to do something they rarely allotted themselves the luxury of doing, getting out of the office and devoting all their time to their craft. What an important reminder in our present world, filled to the brim with social, occupational, political, financial, and domestic responsibilities, how incredibly important it is for those who find a calling in creating to create. This also speaks to the amount of heart and soul that Petey and Jim have and continue to put into this gallery, devoting their time in supporting artists and allowing them to focus on the most important part of their profession, the art itself. I find this to be an incredibly special show, not only for the triumphs that were accomplished by these two artists in its making, but for how this truly symbolizes what this gallery, what these two artists do for the artists of our greater community. Provide a space and provide the other end support that many artists in this region and beyond are in need of, so they can stay in their studios and in the rhythm of creating and continue to bring beauty into this world, one of humanity's most valuable resources. With that, I give you Petria Mitchell and Jim Giddings.
Thank you, Aaron. So let me just talk for a half a second about a format. It's fairly informal, but I'm going to say a few things, and I'll read it a little bit from my artist statement, talk about a topic that I'd like to, and during that time, and perhaps you'll have some questions, I'll refer to some paintings, but I don't want to go too long. Petey's going to do more or less the same thing, talk about her paintings, and then we'll come together and kind of open it up as a free-for-all, questions and answers. But I'll start off, but I want to kind of limit the amount of question and answer initially, just so that it doesn't go too long just in one direction. So this exhibit was supposed to bring together oils and watercolors. I'm talking about my half of the show. But the watercolors seemed to dominate, and it was impossible to just move between the two disciplines in a short amount of time. I had intended, partly I didn't know if I could get any brand new watercolor for a show in the short amount of time that Aaron referred to. And I was able to get more of that together, and I also didn't want my show to be a statement about the studio fire. I really am thankful for what I've gotten from it, but I didn't want the show to be in any way look at burned remnants of paintings. And I also said, I think, and when we were first advertising the show, that I wanted to have sort of a mix, an eclectic mix of oil paint sticks and watercolors. And so I do have 2 oil paint sticks here. The rest are watercolors. So that's how the show actually came into, how it settled, I should say, and into what it is today. And then for my artist statement, I'd just like to read this. I've talked about pushing oil paint around in other artist statements, adding and removing paint as I add and remove insights. Returning to watercolor after 30 years was more of a challenge than I imagined, but David Rohn's exhibition, Watercolors and Wisdom, were an inspiration. We have to enter the work with a totally free or empty mind, he suggests, because, quote, supervising a puddle takes all of your attention, unquote. I find my puddles hit the paper already out of control, and I spend the rest of my time reining them back in. But ironically, it's those very first splatters and brush marks that set the stage, and there's a thrill in their absolute freedom and clarity. What's difficult is keeping that personality alive while trying to corral the exuberant dribbles. So this is a way of introducing something that I felt viscerally and very strongly as I was beginning to start painting with watercolors once again. And like I said in the statement, I haven't done watercolors for 30 years or so. There's a painting on the back wall in the hallway, which was done in 1986, and that probably is one of the last ones that I did before these new watercolor paintings, which I did in these previous 4 or 5 weeks. And that is that I had a piece of paper this size, it's 22 by 30, and I do a lot of splattering. I try to control it, but it doesn't work very well. And so I laid down this row of splatters supposedly to start me off on a woods scene, so they represented branches or leaves or something. And it was, I'll use the word again, a visceral, emotional, and intellectual even thrill. I saw something that I adored, and that was just this first amount of paint laid down on a piece of paper. Now I have the rest of it to fill, and the trick is to keep that going. And so with the watercolors, I'm starting at a place where there's intense excitement and anticipation, and sometimes it just goes downhill from there. It's really a tough act to follow. You start high, and where do you go from there? Sometimes it works, often it doesn't, especially when you're jumping back into something you haven't visited for 30 years. And I have a lot of failures to prove that. But I was able to get some paintings together. And for the time between these watercolors was spent with oil paint sticks. And I realized that my starting point with the paint sticks is quite different. Where I start, it's almost like going in and sitting down and sort of, well, it's work. It's hard work. You have to sit down there. It's a studio effort, so it's you sit there and you don't know what you're going to paint, or if you do, the initial painting for me doesn't contain that incredible thrill. I love that I'm doing it, but it's almost like I'm starting with low expectations. I'll back up on that. With high expectations, but it's very preliminary and sort of getting the work going and building towards that thrill that I found at the very beginning of the watercolor. So it's an idea, and I can't wait to have questions from you, because to me, and as I recognize it, it's a very fundamental difference between the watercolor and the oil painting, how I begin them. And I have to say that I hope that the watercolor ends on that high note as well. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that, and I have talked about this in other times, when I started doing the oil paint sticks, again, I've got the two over here, I thought that working with thick, heavy paint, I've never really been good at that, and I don't really enjoy it for myself. And the result is I end up removing a lot of paint and adding paint, then removing paint, and it ends up being handled in a very similar fashion to a watercolor, where the light from the light goes through the paint, comes reflected back off of the paper, and that gives it there's a transparency involved. It gives it that life and the lightness that we enjoy with watercolors. Most people with their oils will add paint, a lot of paint for the light colors and fairly thin on the darks. I do pretty much the opposite. So the light color in those two paintings is the paper, or such a thin wash of oil paint that, again, is like a watercolor. So those are the differences that I see and enjoy, and I didn't really appreciate them until I started painting these last watercolors. And I believe that the list of titles and prices that comes with this show does suggest that there are 4 new watercolors. It would be the one on the title wall. We had another wall, for those of you who hadn't seen the exhibit before, we had a wall, freestanding wall here, separating the two shows. My watercolor was on this side, Petey's oil was on this side, so that's why they're on the ground now. But so back to my point, that watercolor on the title wall, this painting on the floor, and this painting are brand new, all done within this painting, I think the day before the show opened. And then the others are 30 years or 35 years old. So I'll take a question or two, and then let's give Petey the floor. And it'll be a lot of fun to hear somebody who actually knows what they're doing with the oil paints talk about it.
I'm just curious, when you said you started watercoloring after oil, and you said you started with the splash on.
Yes.
How did that, was it light, dark? How did that?
Well, it can be both. I can either start with the light or the dark. I've done both. I found when I started, one thing that I was seeking with my oil paint sticks, and many of you probably here understand it when I say that my paintings tend to be a little bit dark. I stopped doing watercolors because I wanted to push the medium farther than I thought I could do with watercolors. And the oil paint sticks allowed me to mix graphite with it and get really dark and deep and rich, and I thought very mysterious and intriguing colors or values. So when I started these watercolors, my splatters were as dark as I could make them. There was a lot of pigment and a lot of water. The puddles took forever to dry, so I was left twiddling my thumbs, because you can't start painting around that puddle. If you hit the puddle, it empties into everything that you didn't want. Which explains, and we can get into this more in the questions and answers, it explains a lot of why there's so much white there, because I was staying away from the wet sections. Once I started doing that, I thought, oh, this is kind of cool, let's keep it sparkly like that. But with these new paintings, I was trying to work dark, and the dark splatters were the first ones, and I was filling the spaces between them with the lighter paint. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Aaron?
In speaking about the difference in your process between watercolor and oil stick, can you contribute any of it to the surrounding environment you were in and what was going on when you produced these pieces? Just meaning you were more viscerally in the act of creating for these pieces, but also you were under a very big time crunch and you didn't have that work planned out in your head. And I think it's incredibly relevant because a lot of artists or a lot of people, the general public, might look at artists and say, well, it just spills out of them. But I don't think often people realize what kind of process is actually involved in continually producing any kind of craft, writing, music, art. And if you could speak to what was going on with you also in this time, being under a time crunch and not necessarily having material on the forefront of your mind, how that could have contributed to that.
That's a really good question. I hadn't.
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, she's asking if I'll loosely paraphrase. There's a difference in the starting and the painting with the two, and what was it that made me decide on watercolors rather than oil paint sticks? Because a limited amount of time, and if it's not just tumbling out of me. Well, let me just answer the question then, Jincy, and perhaps it'll explain the question as I understand it.
It wasn't a very clear question. So
Well, it was. I'm afraid I can't paraphrase it. I understand, I think, what you were meaning. For me, the watercolors have always been an outdoor exercise. I didn't used to have a studio. It was always painted on the spot, almost always. And the oil paint sticks represented a move to the studio and became much more inward. And I had been toying with the idea of watercolors, or getting back into watercolors. The big break with the artist, with the studio fire, and buying new materials gave me a great opportunity to just jump right in. But to your question, I also realized that the watercolor tends to be done more quickly, certainly, than my oil paint sticks. I need time for that to dry. Conceptualizing something when I don't know what I'm after when I start takes a lot of time. Sometimes for a painting it might wait for weeks or months before I have changed it enough so that I can find something. And the watercolors, at least I could do a painting and do another painting and do another painting. A lot of them didn't work, but at least I had that opportunity. So it was a fortuitous sort of choice. Yeah, it was, I guess a lot of things came together with that decision, and that's a great question. The way I do the oil paint sticks, I would have been lucky to. The other thing about the watercolors, and then I want to give the floor over to Petey, is I felt like I needed to start from a place of comfort. And that's a sort of a sad admission, because most of us want to be looking forward and doing something brand new every single time. And it's easy to look back, go to a place where you're comfortable, and pick up and try to repeat that. I didn't want to repeat it, but at least it let me get into the studio and take a deep breath and say, well, I think I know how to do a landscape. Let me work on some landscapes. If you look closely at the 3 of the 4 new ones anyway, they are quite different from what I was doing, but there's a huge relationship between the paintings from 30 years ago and now. So even though it was a place of comfort, I did want to do something new, and I hope to get darker and darker, so you guys will all feel comfortable once again in my big dark world. So, thanks, and I'll love to be talking more and have some more questions, answer some more questions after Petey's done. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
That was great. Deciding to take on doing the show was probably pretty crazy, because we knew, thanks Aaron for that introduction with how maybe our mental states were a little bit wobbly at that point, but I'm really glad that we did. It was probably one of the most meaningful preparations for a show. It's not a huge show, but one of the most meaningful preparations I've ever done, because of Jim being in the studio that's not done. He was about 100 feet from where I was in my studio across Stark Road. And this is the first body of work that I produced in my studio that we've been working on. We bought the building in '01, renovated it. I've been painting, but not in a creating a concerted body of work. So this is the first body of work in the new studio for me. And being really mindful of the amount of pressure that I was under, that we were both under, and knowing that Jim was 100 feet away and we go, and just know that we were right near each other, trying to be really careful about the amount of time that we were putting in. And it was a wonderful exercise, I have to say. There was working with the stress, and so what I love to paint is atmosphere. And that's what you're seeing in front of you is the result of, these are all brand new paintings, and I think. Yeah. And you're seeing themes that I've worked on over the last 25 years or so, but it's taking it, for me, a lot farther into emotional atmosphere, which I love walking around in that place. And it's interesting that I seem to get into this hook. I mean, the last artist talk from my solo here, somebody brought up, well, you seem to have this hook, this directional piece with the rivers that I always do. So yeah, you're seeing that happening repeated with being either right-handed or left-handed, but it's, I'm just letting it do it. So I'm not questioning it. I said, okay, how am I going to be hanging the show if that's the case? I said, I'm not going to worry about it. So just working with really rich color and a lot of contrast. But again, atmosphere is the thing that I'm really excited by here, and especially my favorite part of this painting is this edge here with the atmosphere, and this edge and this edge, and it's just so much fun. And I think probably the painting that is the most energetic is this one, Quiet at 5 a.m. Because yeah, quiet at 5 a.m. But look at all the activity that makes you feel not exactly quiet. But I love this painting because of the amount of atmosphere and activity that's happening in the sky. What's unusual for this, for me, is that I really like either very high or very low horizon lines. And I broke a lot of my own rules, which was going towards the middle in this one, and this one's up a little bit higher. But so that's really scary for me, was uncomfortable for me. So I decided to just get my mind, or your mind, off of this and just go bananas up here. And that was really helpful. And I love the contrast of the purple and the orange, the cool and the warm colors. But I guess I would say that this is really all about emotional atmosphere for where I was at the time, which was turbulent, and some fear, but also excitement about taking on the idea of doing a show, creating work in 6 weeks. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and I'm just really pleased that we were both able to really produce work in our studios near each other for the first time. So slap me. We did it. I'm done. Uh-oh. Are there questions from people?
Well, I just want to prompt you further. It seems that these pieces for you, if people don't know, they're completely created from your imagination. They're not taken from looking at a source. You seem to be describing an emotional catharsis that happens through the act of painting. And I wonder if you could go into a little detail of how it's incredibly important for you to produce these pieces, what it does for you as a person, just personally what it does for you. What kind of catharsis does it give you to do this? Because these are very emotional pieces. And being imaginary, they have an incredible amount of affectual energy off of them, and what that process does for you.
Letting paint really have its own personality and its own voice is really important to me. So getting myself at the classic statement of getting yourself out of the way and just letting things go where they want to go. Just purely moving paint around, which is the first thing that I forget, but then when I get back into the studio, I remember. It's like, there's a lot of painters here, putting the smock on you, it's almost like Batman. You get into your gig. Just putting paint down for me is the catharsis of, if there's fear of trying to figure out what's going to be coming out, I do start with thumbnail sketches most often. These are all from my imagination, and I start with thumbnail sketches about this big, and they're basically quite abstract, and then going into something that turns into these. But purely just putting the paint down is a invigorating release of anxiety, because I feel like I'm connected to myself when I'm moving paint around. I think Jim was mentioning something about the in-between place. You're starting with all of this, and then you go, ooh, then the composition starts having trouble, and then you turn it towards the wall, and then hopefully you can pull it off. I'm kind of branching off from your question, but what was so interesting is that there's so many more paintings in the studio, because I was so grateful that I was really producing a lot of work for the first time in a lot of years that were deleted from the show, pieces that were deleted that I couldn't put in. But I think what I'll do, maybe halfway, and I'll swap them out. Maybe that's what I'll do. Or if something sells, which we hope happens, then I'll let them go and then put a new piece up, which would be really great.
Do you use photographs? Are you plein air? Do you go out and paint in plein air? Do you imagine your landscapes from beginning to end? Do you, for your skies, for example, or the trees or the configuration of the landscape, do you refer to maybe photographs you've taken or other photographs?
No, they're just sketches of horizon lines, land, river, sky, shape.
Which you do in plein air?
They're all done in the studio. I'm not painting outside. I'm sketching outside sometimes. Like if I see a color variation that I really like, I'll maybe sketch it very quickly with just a few lines, and then make a note of, okay, this is Indian yellow along with Prussian blue or something. And then that basic hint, a jumping off point will be a place where I'll maybe start a painting. So it starts the connecting process. But
Steve?
who's it for?
About your colors,
Is it for me or for Jim?
it's for you.
Okay.
Regarding your colors, did your palette look any different this time with the fact that your colors are more intense? Or is it always the same palette that you always have and you just made different selections?
I work with I start out with from the tube, very limited palette, and I mix all my colors, but you're seeing probably a similar thread that you've seen over the last several years of Indian yellow. I don't use a lot of cad red or anything, a lot of Prussian blue, a lot of viridian, phthalo green, phthalo blue. And then I mix from there, dioxazine purple, I really like that, and mixing that with ultramarine blue. But I don't go very beyond that. There's yellow ochre, but then I stay probably within maybe 8 colors and then mix from there. Did I answer your question?
I have
Probably
two
not.
follow-up questions. One is, do you work on more than one piece at a time? And like for this one, which has, it seems to me, a more limited palette that's not as intense, did you know that when you got started?
That was probably one of the few pieces in this show that did have the bones of a beginning that I didn't want to change. It's very, very different, but so it was a muted painting. What existed, why I wanted to work on that, was because this was a painting that was not working, but this was. So this part existed before, but everything else was changed. So I decided to stay with that very muted fall palette. Yeah.
And you do work on more than one at a time or not?
Maybe 2. I mean, the upstairs studio is small, like you know, so there's really not a lot of flat area where the lights will work properly for me to paint. So 2, but then I put them on the other side, and then I'll put 2 more up that might be somehow simpatico. They would need to be simpatico to some degree. Let's say this one that's behind Ethan and that one. They're in a similar color palette, and they're doing a dark mountain atmospheric thing. So they would be up on the wall, let's say, at the same time. Let's say, well, there's nothing like this one. The purple one had to be by itself. It was pretty loud, so I needed to paint that by itself.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is there another question? No?
I thought I saw.
Does Jim have a question? Does
Well,
Michelle?
I had one. I was waiting. I thought I saw a couple of. Well, I'll ask it anyway because I got the floor. There's two things that I notice about Petey's, and two things which intrigue me. There are two paintings here: the small upper one, and then the horizontal one on that wall, which the fog is closing in and setting apart a shape, a form, a subject. And that intrigues me. I love that as a compositional element. And so that's one thing. I don't know what that's about, but the idea of floating something, you can imagine a couch in a room or something like that, or a mountain in a hill, on a hillside or something. So that's one thing that I noticed that I've never seen in Petey's work before. And the other is the darkness and richness seems to be magnified consistently throughout this work, with perhaps the exception of the one that she was talking about, the one that's on the floor. And I think, to me, it's remarkable, and it's very powerful. And there's a richness, again, that I see that I hadn't seen before. So I don't know if can you tell me, we've never asked this is unrehearsed here, can you tell me about floating that hill or whatever, that dark shape in the upper painting there, and then, I don't know the title of your #1 painting there.
What would you like to know?
Why?
Why am I doing that?
Why are you floating it? Is it an art, is it a compositional thing only, or are you?
No. I mean, this one, the long, skinny painting, and that the child of that, it really has a lot to do with being spiritually, emotionally enveloped in something that's very unknown, that's ethereal. That mountain, and in that one, it went down to the bottom of the picture at first, and I said, no. I mean, I started changing with where the top of the mountain was, but I said, no, I really wanted it to be surrounded by that, because that's the space that I was in. So using landscape and atmosphere as a way to express where I was at was where that came from. Yeah. Hi, Michelle. Is that for Jim or for me?
No, I was just a comment on the floating form, which is reminiscent. If you look at some of the Japanese woodcuts where the mountains are floating, it gives a sense of lightness and elevation, not just physically, emotionally elevation to the piece. So I love that aspect in the painting you have. But I did have Jim on you talked about the blobs and the fact that you're working with watercolor and you don't want the blobs to bleed. If you go close to it, it bleeds into it, and then you've got something else. And you said that you referred to the white spaces in those paintings, and to me, I mean, that's a beautiful aspect of the work. I think that's really something that makes the whole piece stand out. And in a way, for me, it's a little bit like in music, a musical phrase, when you have two notes and you have a silence in the middle or breathing in the middle. There's nothing going on, but yet it becomes part of the structure. And so, to me, I think those elements here are really very, very nice. And I see that emphasized perhaps a little bit more than you do in your oil painting, where you tend to cover the whole surface.
Right, it's really true.
It's a nice aspect.
Thank you. That's something I don't do with the oils very often. Probably any white that shows is just around the edge at best. But I do tend to cover the entire thing to start with. So I almost am eliminating the possibility of doing that from the very beginning. And to be fair, there was a lot of painting done after those first puddles had dried. So it's easy to say I stayed away from the wet paint, but having been doing that and realizing that that's what was happening, I continued that after the paint was dry. I still kept that going. And I liked the sparkle and the lightness. And a task in front of me is to start closing that space down and seeing if I can keep the lightness. I don't know. I'll just say it again. I'm on record now. I do want to make these richer, and I hope that that isn't just doesn't translate as darker. I want to get some of the richness that I see in the oil paintings, like Petey does. It's a challenge for me. I left the watercolors because it wasn't satisfying that sense of what I was hoping to get out of watercolor, and I've seen it.
Well, that one right next to you is a little bit different, but it's a very beautiful, softer look, and that's also really a wonderful piece.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That one, I lost control of it. I thought it would be a lot darker, but I saw that it wasn't going to be, and so I just. That's true. Yeah. And then the blue one on the side wall over there is very similar to this, in that it stayed light, but that's okay. It's all right. That's what the painting was giving me.
On these notes, a question for you both to answer individually would be, what for you, when you're doing a piece, cues you to know that the piece is finished? How do you know that a piece is finished? You talking about your process of creating the floating objects and you talking about the piece going where I want it to go. It's always very intriguing to me to know how an artist finds a piece to be finished and how you deal with that and how you actually know intuitively that it's done to you or done for that time. But
who's first? I'll go. One of the things that I keep coming back to is clarity. And one of the things I've never been able to really define well is clarity. But for me, it's always visual first, and the content or the narrative is second. And so usually when I'm talking about clarity, I don't want mud in my watercolors. I don't want confusion, visual or otherwise. And with the watercolors, that sense of lightness, I think, is important. With the oil paint sticks, they get darker, but still you can get dark with oil paint sticks and maintain that sense of visual clarity. So it's hard for me to define it because it may be different for other people and people who are looking at my paintings. Yeah. So as far as I'm painting it and I'm trying to come to that conclusion, and with this painting, this is a fairly limited value scale. Most of the white has been eaten up by paint. And at the end, I was starting to put in these little green tree trunks. And I didn't want to add more because I thought it would become confusing. It certainly gives a message, to me anyway, that there's a woods and that those are trees. And once that message is complete, I don't need anything more, unless, as long as the things are balancing, as long as, with my paintings, usually there's a fairly, I think, good balance between, or on the entire page, corner to corner. There's a lot of visual interest to me around the edges, as much as there is in the center of the painting. And I hope when people approach the paintings, when they come closer, that they feel that sense of surprise, because they're going to see more things in the painting that they can't from a distance, and that includes the edges I intentionally painted this edge dark green because I thought that was interesting. But all of that, there's a point where I say, no more, because now it's confusing me, and I'm picking away with expectations, and I've got everything out of the painting that I want. So the idea of clarity is important to me, visual clarity, and visual. Well, I'll just leave it there. Visual clarity. So, Pete, I think the question is now yours.
Oh.
The idea of completeness. When is it complete?
Okay.
When's it? It's not something that's a real conscious compositional feeling of clarity, but all of a sudden I take my finger and go and just cut through the paint like this, and that is where I feel finished, and that's a very unconscious place that I'm in when I do that. Yeah, so I guess when I do that, I feel like that's not exactly a period, kind of a comma. Many artists go back in, I'm guilty, not guilty, I've done that also. That one was not finished. I changed it, but the rest are all completely different compositions. But I think it's when I do that, it's just a thing that I do that is a kind of like an exclamation point. It's done. At the moment.
Maybe like a story that or an article or something, that there's a point where you don't have anything more to say about it. At that point, in that particular.
Yeah.
That particular.
Yeah, and it's really good to have some separation from the paintings too, because this show was really interesting with needing or choosing to find some clarity in a finished point, get them in the frame, and not having enough time with them to feel that maybe they were visually resolved or not. I feel most of them were. Sometimes I come in and go, oh, I really wished I did that. But I say, you know what, they are what they are for when they were painted, at the time they were painted. And that's a big deal for me, personally, to have it be that way.
I think that's a really good analogy, the idea that you don't have anything more to say. But it's just that we're talking about paintings now, so you don't have anything more to say visually. And also, to Petey's point, you can come back and say, well, I didn't quite get 100% with this painting, but from my perspective, I say, and I said it to John Gregg, who was here giving his artist talk, I said, well, I've always said that the answer lies in the next painting. Well, he's a Zen Buddhist and says, well, that means you have expectations and questions, and so you're already on the wrong path or something like that. He lost me, and I couldn't quite create a good verbal response. I think there's something that's okay about my response, but I couldn't get into it with him because he had me. but I do think that, and I'll just put up my little banner again. I think that for me, there is a purpose of leaving one and going on to another. John, for instance, go onto our website and look up John Gregg. He continually paints and paints and paints on the same painting. How he manages to create a huge body of work, I don't know, because he always seems to be working on the same painting. But anyway, when I said that, I meant it, I still mean it, and I'd love to somehow figure it out with John. David, you had a question.
I want to ask Petey, are you influenced by de Kooning? Were you in your youth?
Was I what?
Influenced by Willem de Kooning.
I would say no. In an answer, not really.
Well, it occurred to me for a couple of reasons. One time long ago in Soho, I was at an artist's conference at a show that was showing figurative art. and being New York, they were fanatically figurative, this group. So much, I mean, one person got up and denounced Philip Pearlstein for cutting off legs and arms in his, and that should, but that sort of thing. And finally, one of the artists, I can't remember who, but stood up and said, "Look, you guys, like we're all, you people, we're all arguing about these, tedious and trivial things, but we have to realize that we're all up against de Kooning." So in looking at your work, and you made some remark about that you use the landscape to make a painting. You said that. I heard you.
I use the landscape to make a painting?
Yeah.
Did I say that?
Say yes.
Okay.
If you didn't say it, you should have said it.
Okay, David.
I second that. I think it's
No, I'm just talking about the abstract
Right.
qualities in your work, and that the way that de Kooning makes such a muscular surface and bends everything to that and your paintings do that, and they bend a lot of things. I mean, they're very unrealistic landscapes.
Oh, good.
And they're minimalized. And I'm sitting here in the music section, so I had to put my comments in terms of music, and I was saying like that painting is like a string trio, and the orange is the cello. You see, and she said so. So the tune, somebody might say, well, the tune actually ought to have some piccolos and something else. You don't do that. You do it with the cello, and you bring out the maximum resonance of the cello, as you do with the orange. I mean, there's no field that looks like that. And the river is completely minimal, so we can, I mean, it's black and white and gray. In the one behind you. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. So we see it as a very simple gesture. I mean, we see a river, but it's also a clear gesture. It speaks one language. And I mean, landscapes don't look like that, and other people paint landscapes. They don't look like that. Because a field's got all these different colors, and they're so wonderful, and this sort of thing. But this comes off as like a de Kooning stroke that exists as a stroke and a thought.
I like that, David.
I can't make it. I was trying to make a question, but I just want to give a lecture. My lecture's over.
Thanks, David.
Hi.
Can you talk about your choice of palette? What went in that for you?
One in particular, or just in general?
Just in
'Cause
general.
it
Well,
is-
the three that I see here,
Yeah.
I've seen the other, but I can't remember what you chose, what your palette was.
Yeah, I tend to work with a minimalist palette. Often it's monochromatic. Basically, I think of this as monochromatic. There's an irony to this one. There's a tube paint called olive green, and if you put enough of it with enough water, and talking about that little puddle again, and wait for it to dry, the color separates a brown and a green, and so it looks like I was using two colors, but for the most part it's just one tube paint which separated out. One of them settles. I'm content and really happy to work with the one or two colors. The large painting, I tried to introduce blue, and it wasn't working for me. I thought, well, I'll be kind of something or other. I'll make this work with blue shadows, and I had blue, and I thought I ruined it, so I dabbed some of it out and covered. Once it was dry, I covered the blue with an ochre, I think, and got, I think, a fairly satisfactory look. But I don't work a lot with colors, and color itself isn't a big feature. It's not an important part of my painting. I love colorful painting. I'm in love with the richness and the variety of the colors that Petey chooses, but mine, being monochromatic, I depend on something else, and it's usually the value relationships. And with a lot of the oil paint sticks, which some of you are familiar with, that have subjects in them like birds or people or letters or something like that. Those subjects, those items become important. It's not the color, but I'm trying to make relationships between those. So the color just helps it all out, gives it an atmosphere or a sense of mood or, mood, I guess. And I found when I was just doing this work for the last few weeks that I bought a fairly large palette of different colors, and I don't even know if I'll get to some of them. I saw some of the yellows and oranges, and I thought, oh my God, that's scary. I don't know what orange would do to these. I think it would just be a whole different world. And frankly, that's sort of scary to me.
So because I don't know your body of work, that's why I asked that. When you do, in general, so you might choose some colors, or is it that and just decide to work with those colors and let the subject come as a result of those colors, or how do you then? Would you explore reds in these trees and not green, for instance?
Yeah, usually I'm starting with the subject with these first. And I just keep referring to another large painting similar to this that started with, and I used the word in my artist statement and I've used it talking, it was an incredible thrill to see this pattern go down. It's a very dark green. The green was dictated, it was green, I think, mixed with black, and that was dictated by the subject, forest, woods. And then everything else was secondary to that. I couldn't pull that painting off. I started this with the same hope that I could make one work, and it ended up wildly different from what I thought it might. I didn't expect to see this opening come up through the woods, but so yeah, in that case, I think it's just sort of an elemental choice of colors, green, woods, although on the other wall, there's a woods scene that's blue. And I'm not quite sure why that happened, but that's what happened.
So could it be that you'd be attracted by, let's just say, a certain color, and what you could do with that color, and let that kind of dictate what you would do with a painting?
Yeah, I have favorite colors that I use over and over again. So even though these are landscapes and I'm choosing the colors for the landscape, very often in my oil paint sticks, I use one or two colors no matter what. These two are both based on a color called, I think that one on the left, certainly the one on the right, turkey umber greenish, which is a manufactured color by an oil paint stick manufacturer in Kingston, New York. And that's a color they created. That also is very much like olive green, which separates out depending on how long I let it sit or how much medium I put with it. The brown and the green separate out a little bit. I don't know if that really answers your question. I wouldn't start out with...
See how you're thinking about it, or letting serendipity or something.
I wouldn't start out with a red. And don't ask me why, but I wouldn't start out with a red. I don't know why, but I'm so attracted to these colors, and they let the somber part of me be joyful or something. I don't know, it's on film now, so I can't back off it. I did try to get some red and blue in this color, in this painting. And if you look closely, there's some red but the red, for me, it's a burnt sienna. Now that's not red, but to me it just sang of warmth in otherwise cold woods. And so that's stepping out on a limb. I'm not averse to color. I love color in other people's work, and I have used color in the past, but it's not a big feature of my everything I do.
So I have a question about how you work two painters together and how I know
100 feet between us.
Well, working colors and paint and how, do you have rules? Like who can comment when on what? And do you only speak when spoken to or asked? Or do you casually kind of walk by and...
I'll jump into that.
I want to see how close her answer is to mine.
We're really considerate of each other. Of course, our doors are always open. I mean, we're accessible, of course. But we always knock. We always say something before we even knock as we're approaching. So somebody can at least start to think about getting out of their space and know that they're going to deal with a human being. But yeah, I think we're really respectful of our time. We very rarely crit each other's work. If I hear Jim walking up the stairs, he's go, "Petey, I'm here. Can I come up?" And I go, "Not right now." Or,
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, when Petey's actually painting, she's very private about her working. So I do tend to stay away. I do always introduce myself as, I'm here. I tend to welcome anybody, but that's easy for me to say because nobody comes up and down our road anyway. So I like to think that I'm there for everybody, but I know that that's not going to happen. But I spent a long time in the mid-'80s to mid-'90s painting in the midst of groups, either on beaches or in bars. And so I got used to people being around me, commenting or not, and I can work in the middle of a crowd. It doesn't bother me at all. Even when Petey comes over, she's not going to critique or talk about what I'm doing, but she can stand there and I can be splattering and making a mess, and it doesn't bother me that she's there. And it wouldn't bother me to have anybody else standing right there. But as far as actually getting into what we are doing now, we don't do that a lot. We tend to be a little bit too kind to each other, like, "Oh, I really like that," rather than, "What the hell are you doing with this? I don't understand it. I think it's a failure." We're a little too polite, perhaps, but.
I don't think that's true.
Okay.
I think that I can remember a couple of instances when we were really politely, visually corrective in our own minds. And it was wonderful. We're not always, obsequious and walking in and being,
No, that's true.
Yeah. It's more like we have to stop painting and get into the garden and start harvesting the 2,000 pounds of beans. But
No, one thing that we share is we love watching the other one paint and come up with something.
Yeah.
It's wonderful because that's what makes us really excited and happy, and it also is there's something symbolic. You come out of the studio with something started or something finished, and it just really feels good. And I love it when I see Petey with paint all over, because I know that it's been a good day, and I don't have to know anything more than that. And
or even if it was a really rugged day painting, just knowing that we're showing up, that we're in our studios, and that's new for these two spaces. So it's no matter what we think of the product, the paintings that we came up with, to me, it was phenomenally triumphant what we were able to do.
Yeah, I will say for this show, I had so many paintings on the wall that I had started and either discarded or wasn't sure, and Petey would say, "Oh, I really like this one and here's why." And I had been dismissing them, but I realized that her insight was actually pretty helpful. It helped me put together some paintings that I probably wouldn't have put in the show. There was the blue one, for instance. From the beginning, Petey thought that was a very successful painting, and I can't say whether I think it's very successful or not, but it was really important for me to just get some paintings out, put them on the wall, and show them. It's hugely important. It was a big big thing for me to be able to do that in a brand new studio. It was so important and so symbolic.
And here I am across the street. I have electricity. I don't have running water, but I have electricity. Oh, and I have heat if I need it, but you don't have any of that yet.
Not yet.
So, but it's just really neat to work with a virginal space and know that it's there. And then when you think of next week is a year since the fire, and there's a foundation that has been built on. And no pun intended, there's just like all these emotional foundations that are being built on too, and spiritual foundations that it's just a really big deal this time in our lives, it feels like.
Yeah. I wasn't going to mention there's a painting over the desk. It's a big painting, which you might have seen. It was partially destroyed by the fire. It was a painting that I hadn't really thought was very successful. And in its transformation in the fire, it became quite special. I think it looks beautiful. It's just something totally unlike anything I could have possibly tried to do. And so it's just one little thing out of, everything that was burned. I mean, you take a painting that you like and you burn it, and now you don't like it because it's burned. This one took something that I didn't really like, and now I like it. So, go figure.
So does it mean you're going to use one of those, Sharon, what do you call those torches for food? What do you call those?
So it's a small blowtorch.
Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest that as a starting method for painting techniques.
Creme brulee torch, yeah.
Yeah.
To make burn edges
but it is
and stuff
kind of
like
interesting,
that.
So.
Yeah.
So that's that was something to just.
Are there any more
out.
questions or comments or anything?
Great show.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.